Section 10 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. The Carason, Chapter 6, The Consequences. But at last the spring came, and after the spring, the summer. And the very first warm day, Colin took his spade and pickaxe, and down rushed the stream once more, singing and bounding into the cottage. Colin was even more delighted than he had been the first time, and he watched late into the night, but there came neither moon nor fairy fleet, and more than a week passed thus. At length, on the 9th night, Colin, who had just fallen asleep, opened his eyes with sudden wakefulness, and behold, the room was all in a glimmer with moonshine and fairy glitter. The boats were rocking on the water, and the Queen and her court had landed and were dancing merrily on the earthen floor. He lost no time. "Queen, Queen," he said, "I've got your bottle of Carason." The dance ceased in a moment, and the Queen bounded upon the edge of his bed. "I can't bear the look of your great glaring ugly eyes," she said. "I must make you less before I can talk to you." So once more she laid her rush wand across his eyes, whereupon Colin saw them all 6 times the size they were before, and the Queen went on. "Where is the Carason? Give it to me." "It is in my box under the bed. If your Majesty will stand out of the way, I will get it for you." The Queen jumped on the floor, and Colin, leaning from the bed, pulled out his little box and got out the bottle. "There it is, your Majesty," he said, but not offering it to her. "Give it to me directly," said the Queen, holding out her hand. "First, give me my little girl," returned Colin boldly. "Do you dare to bargain with me?" said the Queen angrily. "Your Majesty deigned to bargain with me first," said Colin. "But since then you tried to break all our necks. You made a wicked cataract out of there on the other side of the garden. Our boats were all dashed to pieces, and we had to wait till our horses were fetched. If I had been killed, you couldn't have held me to my bargain, and I won't hold to it now." "If you chose to go down my cataract," began Colin. "Your cataract?" cried the Queen. "All the waters that run from Loch Lonely are mine. I can tell you all the way to the sea, except where they run through farmyards, your Majesty." "I'll rout you out of the country," said the Queen. "Meantime, I'll put the bottle in the chest again," returned Colin. The Queen bit her lips with vexation. "Come here, changeling," she cried at length in a flattering tone, and the little girl came slowly up to her and stood staring at Colin with the tears in her eyes. "Give me your hand, little girl," said he, holding out his. She did so. It was cold as ice. "Let go her hand," said the Queen. "I won't," said Colin. "She's mine." "Give me the bottle then," said the Queen. "Don't," said the child. But it was too late. The Queen had it. "Keep your girl," she cried with an ugly laugh. "Yes, keep me," cried the child. The cry ended in a hiss. Colin felt something slimy wriggling in his grasp, and looking down, saw that instead of a little girl, he was holding a great writhing worm. He had almost flung it from him, but recovering himself, he grasped it tighter. "If it's a snake, I'll choke it," he said. "If it's a girl, I'll keep her." The same instant it changed to a little white rabbit, which looked him piteously in the face and pulled to get its little forefoot out of his hand. But though he tried not to hurt it, Colin would not let it go. Then the rabbit changed to a great black cat with eyes that flashed green fire. She sputtered and spit and swelled her tail, but all to no purpose. Colin held fast. Then it was a wood pigeon, struggling and fluttering in terror to get its wing out of his hold, but Colin still held fast. All this time the Queen had been getting the cork out. The moment it yielded, she gave a scream and dropped the bottle. The Carason ran out, and a strange odour filled the cottage. The Queen stood shivering and sobbing beside the bottle, and all her court came about her and shivered and sobbed too, and their faces grew ancient and wrinkled. Then the Queen, bending and tottering like an old woman, led the way to the boats, and her courtiers followed her, limping and creeping and distorted. Colin stared in amazement. He saw them all go aboard, and he heard the sound of them like a far-off company of men and women crying bitterly. And away they floated down the stream, the rowers dipping no oar, but bending, weeping over them, and letting the boats drift along the stream. They vanished from his sight, and the rush of the cataract came up on the night wind, louder than he had ever heard it before. But alas, when he came to himself, he found his hand relaxed, and the dove flown. Once more there was nothing left but to cry himself asleep, as he well might. In the morning he rose very wretched, but the moment he entered the cow-house, there, beside the cow on a milking stool, sat a lovely little girl with just one white garment on her, crying bitterly. "I am so cold," she said, sobbing. He caught her up, ran with her into the house, put her into the bed, and ran back to the cow for a bowl of warm milk. This she drank eagerly, laid her head down, and fell fast asleep. Then Colin saw that though she must be 8 years old by her own account, her face was scarcely older than that of a baby of as many months. When his father came home, you may be sure he stared to see the child in the bed. Colin told him what had happened, but his father said he had met a troop of gypsies on the hill that morning. "And you were always a dreamer, Colin, even before you could speak." "But don't you smell the Carason still?" said Colin. "I do smell something very pleasant, to be sure," returned his father, "but I think it is the wallflower on the top of the garden wall. What a blossom there is of it this year! I am sure there is nothing sweeter in all Fairyland, Colin." Colin allowed that. The little girl slept for 3 whole days, and for 3 days more she never said another word than, "I am so cold." But after that she began to revive a little, and to take notice of things about her. For 3 weeks she would taste nothing but milk from the cow, and would not move from the chimney corner. By degrees, however, she began to help Colin a little with his housework, and as she did so, her face gathered more and more expression, and she made such progress that by the end of 3 months she could do everything as well as Colin himself, and certainly more neatly. Whereupon he gave up his duties to her and went out with his father to learn the calling of a shepherd. Thus things went on for 3 years, and Fairy, as they called her, grew lovelier every day, and looked up to Colin more and more every day. At the end of the 3 years, his father sent him to an old friend of his, a schoolmaster. Before he left, he made Fairy promise never to go near the brook after sundown. He had turned it into its old channel the very day she came to them, and he begged his father especially to look after her when the moon was high, for then she grew very restless and strange, and her eyes looked as if she saw things other people could not see. When the end of the other 3 years had come, the schoolmaster would not let Colin go home, but insisted on sending him to college, and there he remained for 3 years more. When he returned at the end of that time, he found Fairy so beautiful and so wise that he fell dreadfully in love with her, and Fairy found out that she had been in love with him since ever so long, she did not know how long, and Colin's father agreed that they should be married as soon as Colin should have a house to take her to. So Colin went away to London and worked very hard, till at last he managed to get a little cottage in Devonshire to live in. Then he went back to Scotland and married Fairy. And he was very glad to get her away from the neighbourhood of a queen who was not to be depended upon. End of section 10. Section 11 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. The Carason, Chapter 7. The Banished Fairies. Those fairies had for a long time been doing wicked things. They had played many ill-natured pranks upon the human mortals, had stolen children upon whom they had no claim, had refused to deliver them up when they were demanded of them, had even terrified infants in their cradles, and, final proof of moral declension in fairies, had attempted to get rid of the obligations of their word by all kinds of trickery and false logic. It was not till they had sunk thus low that their queen began to long for the Carason. She, no more than if she had been a daughter of Adam, could be happy while going on in that way, and therefore, having heard of its marvellous virtues, and thinking it would stop her growing misery, she tried hard to procure it. For 100 years she had tried in vain. Not till Colin arose did she succeed. But the Carason was only for really good people, and therefore, when the iron bottle which contained it was uncorked, she and all her attendants were, by the vapours thereof, suddenly changed into old men and women fairies. They crowded away weeping and lamenting, and Colin had as yet seen them no more. For when the wickedness of any fairy tribe reaches its climax, the punishment that falls upon them is that they are compelled to leave that part of the country where they and their ancestors have lived for more years than they can count, and wander away, driven by an inward restlessness, ever longing after the country they have left, but never able to turn round and go back to it, always thinking they will do so tomorrow, but when tomorrow comes, saying tomorrow again, till at last they find not their old home, but the place of their doom, that is, a place where their restlessness leaves them, and they find they can remain. This partial repose, however, springs from no satisfaction with the place. It is only that their inward doom ceases to drive them further. They sit down to weep, and to long after the country they have left. This is not because the country to which they have been driven is ugly, and inclement it may or may not be such. It is simply because it is not their country. If it would be, and it must be, torture to the fairy of a harebell to go and live in a hyacinth, a torture quite analogous to which many human beings undergo from their birth to their death, and some of them longer. For anything I can think what it must be for the tribe of fairies to have to go and live in a country quite different from that in and for which they were born. To the whole tribe, the country is what the flower is to the individual. And when a fairy is born to whom the whole country is what the individual flower is to the individual fairy, then the fairy is king or queen of the fairies, and always makes a new nursery rhyme for the young fairies, which is never forgotten. When, therefore, a tribe is banished, it is long before they can settle themselves into their new quarters. Their clothes do not fit them, as it were. They are constantly wriggling themselves into harmony with their new circumstances, which is only another word for clothes, and never quite succeeding. It is their punishment and something more. Consequently, their temper is not always of the evenest. Indeed, and in a word, they are as like human mortals as may well be, considering the differences between them. In the present case, you would say it was surely no great hardship to be banished from the heathy hills, the bare rocks, the wee trotting burnies of Scotland, to the rich valleys, the wooded shores, the great rivers, the grand ocean of the south of Devon. You may say they could not have been very wicked when this was all their punishment. If you do, you must have studied the human mortals to no great purpose. You do not believe that a man may be punished by being made very rich? I do. Anyhow, these fairies were not of your opinion, for they were in it. In the splendour of their Devon banishment, they sighed for their bare Scotland. Under the leafy foliage of the Devonshire valleys, with the purple and green ocean before them, that had seen ships of 1,000 bills, or on the shore, rich with shells and many-coloured creatures, they longed for the clear, cold, pensive, open sides of the far-stretching heathy sweeps, to which a grey, wild, torn sea, with memories only of Norsemen, whales and mermaids, cried aloud. For the big rivers, on which reposed great old hulks scarred with battle, they longed after the rocks and stones and rowan and birch trees of the solitary burns. The country they had left might be an ill-favoured thing, but it was their own. Now, that which happens to the aspect of a country when the fairies leave it is that a kind of deadness falls over the landscape. The traveller feels the wind as before, but it does not seem to refresh him. The child sighs over his daisy chain and cannot find a red-tipped one amongst all that he has gathered. The cowslips have not half the honey in them. The wasps outnumber the bees. The horses come from the plough more tired at night, hanging their heads to their very hoofs as they plod homewards. The youth and the maiden, though perfectly happy when they meet, find the road to and from the trysting place unaccountably long and dreary. The hawthorn blossom is neither so white nor so red as it used to be, and the dark, rough bark looks through and makes it ragged. The day is neither so warm nor the night so friendly as before. In a word, that something which no one can describe or be content to go without is missing. Everything is commonplace. Everything falls short of one's expectations. But it does not follow that the country to which the fairies are banished is so much richer and more beautiful for their presence. If that country has its own fairies, it needs no more, and Devon, in especial, has been rich in fairies from the time of the Phoenicians, and ever so long before that. But supposing there were no aborigines left to quarrel with, it takes centuries before the new immigration can fit itself into its new home. Until this comes about, the queerest things are constantly happening. For however could a convolvulus grow right with the soul of a Canterbury bell inside it, for instance? The banished fairies are forced to do the best they can and take the flowers the nearest they can find. End of Section 11. Section 12 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. The Carason. Chapter 8. Their Revenge. When Colin and his wife settled then in their farmhouse, the same tribe of fairies was already in the neighbourhood, and was not long in discovering who had come after them. An assembly was immediately called. Something must be done, but what was disputed. Most of them thought only of revenge to be taken upon the children, but the Queen hesitated. Perhaps her sufferings had done her good. She suggested that before coming to any conclusion, they should wait and watch the household. In consequence of this resolution, they began to frequent the house constantly, and sometimes in great numbers. But for a long time they could do the children no mischief. Whatever they tried turned out to their amusement. They were 3, 2 girls and a boy, the girls 9 and 8, and the boy 3 years old. When they succeeded in enticing them beyond the home boundaries, they would at one time be seized with an unaccountable panic and turn and scurry home without knowing why. At another, a great butterfly or dragonfly or some other winged and lovely creature would dart past them and away towards the house, and they after it scampering, or the voice of their mother would be heard calling from the door. But at last their opportunity arrived. One day the children were having such a game. The sisters had blindfolded their little brother and were carrying him now on their backs, now in their arms, all about the place, now up the stairs, talking about the rugged mountain paths they were climbing, now down again, filling him with the fancy that they were descending into a narrow valley. Then they would set the tap of a rainwater barrel running and represent that they were travelling along the bank of a rivulet. Now they were threading the depths of a great forest, and when the low of a cow reached them from the nigh field, that was the roaring of a lion or a tiger. At length they reached a lake into which the rivulet ran, and then it was necessary to take off his shoes and socks, that he might skim over the water on his bare feet, which they dipped and dabbled now in this tub, now in that, standing for farm and household purposes by the water butt. The sisters kept their own imaginations alive by carrying him through all the strange places inside and outside of the house. When they told him they were ascending a precipice, they were, in fact, climbing a rather difficult ladder up to the door of the hayloft. When they told him they were traversing a pathless desert, they were, in fact, in a vast empty place, a wide floor, used sometimes as a granary, with the rafters of the roof coming down to it on both sides, a place abundantly potent in their feelings to the generation of the desert in his. When they were wandering through a trackless forest, they were, in fact, winding about amongst the trees of a large orchard, which in the moonlight was vast enough for the fancy of any child. Had they uncovered his eyes at any moment, he would only have been seized with a wonder and awe of another sort, more overwhelming because more real, and more strange because not even in part bodied forth from his own brain. In the course of the story, and while they bore the barefooted child through the orchard, telling him they saw the fairies gliding about everywhere through the trees, not thinking that he believed every word they told him, they set him down, and the child suddenly opened his eyes. His sisters were gone. The moon was staring at him out of the sky, through the mossy branches of the apple trees, which he thought looked like old women all about him, they were so thin and bony. When the sisters, who had only for a moment run behind some of the trees, that they might cause him additional amazement, returned, he was gone. There was terrible lamentation in the house, but his father and mother, who were experienced in such matters, knew that the fairies must be in it, and cherished a hope that their son would yet be restored to them, though all their endeavours to find him were unavailing. End of Section 12. Section 13 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. The Carason. Chapter 9. The Fairy Fiddler. The father thought over many plans, but never came upon the right one. He did not know that they were the same tribe which had before carried away his wife when she was an infant. If he had, they might have done something sooner. At length one night, towards the close of 7 years, about 12 o'clock, Colin suddenly opened his eyes, for he had been fast asleep and dreaming, and saw a few grotesque figures which he thought he must have seen before, dancing on the floor between him and the nearly extinguished fire. One of them had a violin, but when Colin first saw him he was not playing. Another of them was singing, and thus keeping the dance in time. This was what he sang, evidently addressed to the fiddler who stood in the centre of the dance. Peterkin, Peterkin, tall and thin, what have you done with his cheek and his chin? What have you done with his ear and his eye? Hearken, hearken, and hear him cry. Here Peterkin put his fiddle to his neck and drew from it a wail just like the cry of a child, at which the dancers danced more furiously. Then he went on playing the tune the other had just sung, in accompaniment to his own reply. Silver snout, short and stout, I have cut them off and plucked them out, and salted them down in the Kelpie's pool, because Papa Colin is such a fool. Then the fiddle cried like a child again, and they danced more wildly than ever. Colin, filled with horror, although he did not more than half believe what they were saying, sat up in bed and stared at them with fierce eyes, waiting to hear what they would say next. Silver Snout now resumed his part. Ho, 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 and if he don't know, and fished them out of the pool so. Here they all pretended to be hauling in a net as they danced. Before the end of the 7 long years, sweet babe will be left without eyes or ears. Then Peterkin replied, Sweet babe will be left without cheek or chin, only a hole to put porridge in, porridge and milk and haggis and cakes. Sweet babe will gobble till his stomach aches. From this last verse, Colin knew that they must be Scotch fairies, and all at once recollected their figures as belonging to the multitude he had once seen frolicking in his father's cottage. It was now Silver Snout's turn. He began, but never more shall Colin see sweet babe again upon his knee, with or without his cheek or chin, except. Here Silver Snout caught sight of Colin's face, staring at him from the bed, and with a shriek of laughter they all vanished, the tones of Peterkin's fiddle trailing after them through the darkness like the train of a shooting star. End of section 13. Section 14 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. The Carason, Chapter 10. The Old Woman and Her Hen. Now Colin had got the better of these fairies once, not by his own skill, but by the help that other powers had afforded him. What were those powers? First, the old woman on the heath. Indeed, he might attribute it all to her. He would go back to Scotland and look for her and find her. But the old woman was never found except by the seeker losing himself. It could not be done otherwise. She would cease to be the old woman and become her own hen, if ever the moment arrived when anyone found her without losing himself. And Colin, since that time, had wandered so much all over the moor, wide as it was, that lay above his father's cottage, that he did not believe he was able to lose himself there any more. He had yet to learn that it did not so much matter where he lost himself, provided only he was lost. Just at this time Colin's purse was nearly empty, and he set out to borrow the money of a friend who lived on the other side of Dartmoor. When he got there he found that he had gone from home. Unable to rest, he set out again to return. It was almost night when he started, and before he had got many miles into the moor it was dark, for there was no moon, and it was so cloudy that he could not see the stars. He thought he knew the way quite well, but as the track even in daylight was in certain places very indistinct, it was no wonder that he strayed from it and found that he had lost himself. The same moment that he became aware of this, he saw a light away to the left. He turned towards it and found it proceeded from a little hive-like hut, the door of which stood open. When he was within a yard or two of it, he heard a voice say, "Come in, Colin, I'm waiting for you." Colin obeyed at once and found the old woman seated with her spindle and distaff, just as he had seen her when he was a boy on the moor above his father's cottage. "How do you do, mother?" he said. "I am always quite well. Never ask me that question." "Well then, I won't any more," returned Colin. "But I thought you lived in Scotland." "I don't live anywhere, but those that will do as I tell them will always find me when they want me." "Do you see yet, mother?" "See? I always see so well that it is not worthwhile to burn eye light. So I let them go out. They were expensive." Where her eyes should have been, there was nothing but wrinkles. "What do you want?" she resumed. "I want my child. The fairies have got him." "I know that. And they have taken out his eyes." "I can make him see without them." "And they've cut off his ears," said Colin. "He can hear without them." "And they've salted down his cheek and his chin." "Now, I don't believe that," said the old woman. "I heard them say so myself," returned Colin. "Those fairies are worse liars than any I know, but something must be done. Sit down and I'll tell you a story." "There's only 9 days of the 7 years left," said Colin, in a tone of expostulation. "I know that as well as you," answered the old woman. "Therefore I say, there is not time to be lost. Sit down and listen to my story. Here, Jenny." The hen came pacing solemnly out from under the bed. "Off to the sheep shearing, Jenny, and make haste, for I must spin faster than usual. There are but 9 days left." Jenny ran out at the door with her head on a level with her tail, as if the kite had been after her. In a few moments she returned with a bunch of wool, as they called it, though it was only cotton from the cotton grass that grew all about the cottage, nearly as big as herself, in her bill, and then darted away for more. The old woman fastened it on her distaff, drew out a thread to her spindle, and then began to spin. And as she spun, she told her story fast, fast, and Jenny kept scampering out and in, and by the time Colin thought it must be midnight, the story was told, and 7 of the 9 days were over. "Colin," said the old woman, "now that you know all about it, you must set off at once." "I am ready," answered Colin, rising. "Keep on the road. Jenny will show you till you come to the cobbler's. Tell him the old woman with the distaff requests him to give you a lump of his wax." "And what am I to do with it?" "The cobbler always knows what his wax is for." And with this answer, the old woman turned her face towards the fire, for although it was summer, it was cold at night on the moor. Colin, moved by sudden curiosity, instead of walking out of the hut after Jenny, as he ought to have done, crept round by the wall and peeped in the old woman's face. There, instead of wrinkled blindness, he saw a pair of flashing orbs of light, which were rather reflected on the fire than had the fire reflected in them. But the same instant, the hut and all that was in it vanished. He felt the cold fog of the moor blowing upon him and fell heavily to the earth. End of section 14. Section 15 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. The Carason, Chapter 11. The Goblin Cobbler. When he came to himself, he lay on the moor still. He got up and gazed around. The moon was up, but there was no hut to be seen. He was sorry enough now that he had been so foolish. He called Jenny, Jenny, but in vain. What was he to do? Tomorrow was the 8th of the 9 days left, and if before 12 at night the following day he had not rescued his boy, nothing could be done, at least for 7 years more. True, the year was not quite out till about 7 the following evening, but the fairies, instead of giving days of grace, always take them. He could do nothing but begin to walk, simply because that gave him a shadow more of a chance of finding the cobblers than if he sat still. But there was no possibility of choosing one direction rather than another. He wandered the rest of that night and the next day. He could not go home before the hour when the cobbler could no longer help him. Such was his anxiety that although he neither ate nor drank, he never thought of the cause of his gathering weakness. As it grew dark, however, he became painfully aware of it, and was just on the point of sitting down exhausted upon a great white stone that looked inviting, when he saw a faint glimmering in front of him. He was erect in a moment, and making towards the place. As he drew near, he became aware of a noise made up of many smaller noises, such as might have proceeded from some kind of factory. Not till he was close to the place could he see that it was a long, low hut, with one door and no windows. The light shone from the door, which stood wide open. He approached and peeped in. There sat a multitude of cobblers, each on his stool, with his candle stuck in the hole in the seat, cobbling away. They looked rather like little men, though not at all of fairy size. The most remarkable thing about them was that at any given moment they were all doing precisely the same thing, as if they had been a piece of machinery. When one drew the threads in stitching, they all did the same. If Colin saw one wax his thread and looked up, he saw that they were all waxing their thread. If one took to hammering on his lapstone, they did not follow his example, but all together with him they caught up their lapstones and fell to hammering away, as if nothing but hammering could ever be demanded of them. And when he came to look at them more closely, he saw that every one was blind of an eye and had a nose turned up like an awl. Every one of them, however, looked different from the rest, notwithstanding a very close resemblance in their features. The moment they caught sight of him, they rose as one man, pointed their awls at him, and advanced towards him like a closing bush of aloes, glittering with spikes. "Fine upper leathers," said one and all, with a variety of accordant grimaces. "Top of his head, good paste bowl," was the next general remark. "Coarse hair, good ends," followed. "Sinews, good thread. Bones and blood, good, paste for 7 leaguers. Ears, good, loops to pull 'em on with, pair short now. Soles, same for queen's slippers." And so on they went, portioning out his body in the most irreverent fashion for the uses of their trade, till having come to his teeth and said, "Teeth good, Brads," they all gave a shriek, like the whisk of the waxed threads through the leather, and sprung upon him with their awls drawn back like daggers. There was no time to lose. "The old woman with the spindle," said Colin. "Don't know her," shrieked the cobblers. "The old woman with the distaff," said Colin, and they all scurried back to their seats and fell to hammering vigorously. "She desired me," continued Colin, "to ask the cobbler for a lump of his wax." Every one of them caught up his lump of wrought rosin and held it out to Colin. He took the one offered by the nearest and found that all their lumps were gone, after which they sat motionless and stared at him. "But what am I to do with it?" asked Colin. "I will walk a little way with you," said the one nearest, "and tell you all about it. The old woman is my grandmother, and a very worthy old soul she is." Colin stepped out at the door of the workshop, and the cobbler followed him. Looking round, Colin saw all the stools vacant, and the place as still as an old churchyard. The cobbler, who now in his talk, gestures, and general demeanour appeared a very respectable, not to say conventional, little man, proceeded to give him all the information he required, accompanying it with the present of one of his favourite awls. They walked a long way, till Colin was amazed to find that his strength stood out so well, but at length the cobbler said, "I see, sir, that the sun is at hand. I must return to my vocation. When the sun is once up, you will know where you are." He turned aside a few yards from the path and entered the open door of a cottage. In a moment the place resounded with the soft hammering of 313 cobblers, each with his candle stuck in a hole in the stool on which he sat. While Colin stood gazing in wonderment, the rim of the sun crept up above the horizon, and there the cottage stood, white and sleeping, while the cobblers, their lights, their stools, and their tools had all vanished. Only there was still the sound of the hammers ringing in his head, where it seemed to shape itself into words, something like these. A good deal had to give way to the rhyme, for they were more particular about their rhymes than their etymology. Dub-a-dub, dub-a-dub, cobbler's man, hammer it, stitch it as fast as you can. The weekday ogre is wanting his boots, the trip-a-trap fairy is going barefoots. Dream daughter has worn out her heels and her toeses, for want of cork slippers to walk over noses. Spark-eye the smith may shoe the nightmare, the kelpie and pookie the 9-footed bear. We shoe the mermaids the tips of their tails, stitching the leather onto their scales. We shoe the brownie clumsy and toeless, and then he goes quiet as a mole or a molus. There is but one creature that we cannot shoe, and that is the boneless, all made of glue. A great deal of nonsense of this sort went through Colin's head before the sounds died away. Then he found himself standing in the field outside his own orchard. End of section 15. Section 16 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. The Carason, Chapter 12. The Wax and the Awl. The evening arrived. The sun was going down over the sea, cloudless, casting gold from him lavishly, when Colin arrived on the shore at some distance from his home. The tide was falling, and a good space of sand was uncovered and lay glittering in the setting sun. This sand lay between some rocks and the sea, and from the rocks innumerable runners of water that had been left behind in their hollows were hurrying back to their mother. These occasionally spread into little shallow lakes, resting in hollows in the sand. These lakes were in a constant ripple from the flow of the little streams through them, and the sun shining on these multitudinous ripples, the sand at the bottom shone like brown silk, watered with gold. Only that the golden lines were flitting about like living things, never for a moment in one place. Now Colin had no need of fairy ointment to anoint his eyes and make him able to see fairies. Most people need this, but Colin was naturally gifted. Therefore, as he drew near a certain high rock, which he knew very well, and from which many streams were flowing back into the sea, He saw that the little lakes about it were crowded with fairies, playing all kinds of pranks in the water. It was a lovely sight to see them thus frolicking in the light of the setting sun, in their gay dresses, sparkling with jewels, or what looked like jewels, flashing all colours as they moved. But Colin had not much time to see them, for the moment they saw him, knowing that this was the man whom they had wronged by stealing his child, and knowing too that he saw them, they fled at once up the high rock and vanished. This was just what Colin wanted. He went all round and round the rock, looked in every direction in which there might be a pool, found more fairies here and there, who fled like the first up the rock and disappeared. When he had thus driven them all from the sands, he approached the rock, taking the lump of cobbler's wax from his pocket as he went. He scrambled up the rock, and without showing his face, put his hand on the uppermost edge of it, and began drawing a line with the wax all along. He went creeping round the rock, still drawing the wax along the edge, till he had completed the circuit. Then he peeped over. Now in the heart of this rock, which was nearly covered at high water, there was a big basin known as the Kelpie's Pool, filled with sea water and the loveliest seaweed and many little sea animals. And this was a favourite resort of the fairies. It was now, of course, crowded. When they saw his big head come peeping over, they burst into a loud fit of laughter and began mocking him and making game of him in 100 ways. Some made the ugliest faces they could, some queer gestures of contempt, others sung bits of songs, and so on, while the Queen sat by herself on a projecting corner of the rock, with her feet in the water, and looked at him sulkily. Many of them kept on plunging and swimming and diving and floating while they mocked him, and Colin would have enjoyed the sight much if they had not spoiled their beauty and their motions by their grimaces and their gestures. "I want my child," said Colin. "Give him his child," cried one. Thereupon a dozen of them dived and brought up a huge sea slug, a horrid creature like the lump of blubber, and held it up to him, saying, "There he is, come down and fetch him." Others offered him a blue lobster, struggling in their grasp, others a spider crab, others a whelk, while some of them sung mocking verses, each capping the line the other gave. At length they lifted a dreadful object from the bottom. It was like a baby with his face half eaten away by the fishes, only that he had a huge nose like the big toe of a lobster. But Colin was not to be taken in. "Very well, good people," he said, "I will try something else." He crept down the rock again, took out the little cobbler's awl, and began boring a hole. It went through the rock as if it had been butter, and as he drew it out, the water followed in a far-reaching spout. He bored another, and went on boring till there were 313 spouts gushing from the rock, and running away in a strong little stream towards the sea. He then sat down on a ledge at the foot of the rock and waited. By and by he heard a clamour of little voices from the basin. They had found that the water was getting very low. But when they discovered the holes by which it was escaping, "He's got Dottlecob's awl! He's got Dottlecob's awl!" they cried with one voice of horror. When he heard this, Colin climbed the rock again to enjoy their confusion. But here I must explain a little. In the former part of this history, I showed how fond these fairies were of water, but the fact was they were far too fond of it. It had grown a thorough dissipation with them. Their business had been chiefly to tend and help the flowers in which they lived, and to do good offices for everything that had any kind of life about them. Hence their name of good people. But from finding the good the water did to the flowers, and from sharing in the refreshment it brought them, flowing up to them in tiny runners through the veins of the plants, they had fallen in love with the water itself, for its own sake, or rather for the pleasure it gave to them, irrespective of the good it was to the flowers which lived upon it. So they neglected their business, and took to sailing on the streams and plunging into every pool they could find. Hence the rapidity of their decline and fall. Again, on coming to the sea-coast, they had found that the salt water did much to restore the beauty they had lost by partaking of the Carason. Therefore, they were constantly on the shore, bathing forever in the water, especially that left in this pool by the ebbing tide, which was particularly to their taste, till at last they had grown entirely dependent for comfort on the sea-water, and, they thought, entirely dependent on it for existence also, at least such existence as was in the least worth possessing. Therefore, when they saw the big face of Colin peering once more over the ledge, they rushed at him in a rage, scrambling up the side of the rock like so many mad beetles. Colin drew back and let them come on. The moment the foremost put his foot on the line that Colin had drawn around the rock, he slipped and tumbled backwards, head over heels into the pool, shrieking, "He's got Dottlecob's wax! He's got Dottlecob's wax!" screamed the next, as he fell backwards after his companion, and this took place till no one would approach the line. In fact, no fairy could keep his footing on the wax, and the line was so broad, for as Colin rubbed it, it had melted and spread that not one of them could spring over it. The Queen now rose. "What do you want, Colin?" she said. "I want my child, as you know very well," answered Colin. "Come and take him," returned the Queen, and sat down again, not now with her feet in the water, for it was much too low for that. But Colin knew better. He sat down on the edge of the basin. Unfortunately, the tail of his coat crossed the line. In a moment, 6 of the fairies were out of the circle. Colin rose instantly, and there was not much harm done, for the multitude was still in prison. The water was nearly gone, beginning to leave the very roots of the long tangles uncovered. At length the Queen could bear it no longer. "Look here, Colin," she said, "I wish you well." And as she spoke, she rose and descended the side of the rock towards the water, now far below her. She had to be very cautious too, the stones were so slippery, though there was none of Dottlecob's wax there. About halfway below where the surface of the pool had been, she stopped and pushed a stone aside. Colin saw what seemed the entrance to a cave inside the rock. The Queen went in. A few moments after, she came out wringing her hands. oh dear, what shall I do?" she cried. "You horrid, thick people will grow so. He's grown to such a size that I can't get him out." "Will you let him go if I get him out?" asked Colin. I will. We shall all be starved to death for want of sea water if I don't," she answered. "Swear by the cobbler's awl and the cobbler's wax," said Colin. "I swear," said the Queen. "By the cobbler's awl and the cobbler's wax," insisted Colin. "I swear by the cobbler's awl and the cobbler's wax," returned the Queen. "In the name of your people?" "In the name of my people," said the Queen, "that none of us here present will ever annoy you or your family hereafter." "Then I'll come down," said Colin, and jumped into the basin. With the cobbler's awl he soon cleared a big opening into the rock, for it bored and cut it like butter. Then out crept a beautiful boy of about 10 years old into his father's arms, with eyes and ears and chin and cheek all safe and sound, and he carried him home to his mother. It was a disappointment to find him so much of a baby at his age, but that fault soon began to mend, and the house was full of jubilation, and little Colin told them the whole story of his sojourn among the fairies. And it did not take so long as you would think, for he fancied he had been there only about a week. End of section 16. Section 17 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts. Section 17. Bon Bon, a Tale. Part 1. Notre Gulliver, dit le Lord Bolingbroke, a de telle fable, Voltaire. That Pierre Bon Bon was a restaurateur of uncommon qualifications. No man who, during the reign of, frequented the little café in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre at Rouen will, I imagine, feel himself at liberty to dispute. That Pierre Bon Bon was, in an equal degree, skilled in the philosophy of that period is, I presume, still more especially undeniable. His pâtés à la fois were beyond doubt immaculate, but what pen can do justice to his essays sur la nature, his thoughts sur l'âme, his observations sur l'esprit? If his omelettes, if his fricandeaux were inestimable, what littérature of that day would not have given twice as much for an idée de bonbon, as for all the trash of all the idées of all the rest of the savants? Bon Bon had ransacked libraries which no other man had ransacked, had read more than any other would have entertained a notion of reading, had understood more than any other would have conceived the possibility of understanding. And although, while he flourished, there were not wanting some authors at Rouen to assert that his dicta evinced neither the purity of the Academy nor the depth of the Lyceum, although, mark me, his doctrines were by no means very generally comprehended. Still, it did not follow that they were difficult of comprehension. It was, I think, on account of their entire self-evidency that many persons were led to consider them abstruse. It is to Bon Bon, but let this go no farther, it is to Bon Bon that Kant himself is mainly indebted for his metaphysics. The former was not indeed a Platonist, nor strictly speaking an Aristotelian, nor did he, like the modern Leibniz, waste those precious hours which might be employed in the invention of a fricassee, or facile gradu, the analysis of a sensation, in frivolous attempts at reconciling the obstinate oils and waters of ethical discussion. Not at all. Bon Bon was ionic. Bon Bon was equally italic. He reasoned a priori. He reasoned also a posteriori. His ideas were innate or otherwise. He believed in George of Trebizond. He believed in Bossarian. Bon Bon was emphatically a bonbonist. I have spoken of the philosopher in his capacity of restaurateur. I would not, however, have any friend of mine imagine that in fulfilling his hereditary duties in that line, our hero wanted a proper estimation of their dignity and importance. Far from it. It was impossible to say in which branch of his duplicate profession he took the greater pride. In his opinion, the powers of the mind held intimate connection with the capabilities of the stomach. By this I do not mean to insinuate a charge of gluttony, or indeed any other serious charge to the prejudice of the metaphysician. If Pierre Bon Bon had his failings, and what great man has not 1,000? If Pierre Bon Bon, I say, had his failings, they were failings of very little importance. faults indeed which in other tempers have often been looked upon rather in the light of virtues. As regards one of these foibles, I should not have mentioned it in this history but for the remarkable prominency, the extreme alto relievo in which it jutted out from the plane of his general disposition. Bon could never let slip an opportunity of making a bargain. Not that Bon was avaricious. No, it was by no means necessary to the satisfaction of the philosopher that the bargain should be to his own proper advantage. Provided a trade could be effected, a trade of any kind, upon any terms or under any circumstances, a triumphant smile was seen for many days thereafter to enlighten his countenance, and a knowing wink of the eye to give evidence of his sagacity. At any epoch it would not be very wonderful if a humour so peculiar as the one I have just mentioned should elicit attention and remark. At the epoch of our narrative, had this peculiarity not attracted observation, there would have been room for wonder indeed. It was soon reported that upon all occasions of the kind, the smile of Bon was wont to differ widely from the downright grin with which that restaurateur would laugh at his own jokes or welcome an acquaintance. Hints were thrown out of an exciting nature. Stories were told of perilous bargains made in a hurry and repented of at leisure, and instances were adduced of unaccountable capacities, vague longings, and unnatural inclinations implanted by the author of all evil for wise purposes of his own. The philosopher had other weaknesses, but they are scarcely worthy of our serious examination. For example, there are few men of extraordinary profundity who are found wanting in an inclination for the bottle. Whether this inclination be an exciting cause, or rather a valid proof of such profundity, it is impossible to say. Bon, as far as I can learn, did not think the subject adapted to minute investigation, nor do I. Yet in the indulgence of a propensity so truly classical, it is not to be supposed that the restaurateur would lose sight of that intuitive discrimination which was wont to characterize, at one and the same time, his essays and his omelettes. With him, Sauterne was to Medoc what Catullus was to Homer. He would sport with a syllogism in sipping Saint-Péray, but unravel an argument over Clos de Vougeot and upset a theory in a torrent of Chambertin. In his seclusions, the Vin de Bourgogne had its allotted hour, and there were appropriate moments for the Côte de Rhône. Well, had it been if the same quick sense of propriety had attended him in the peddling propensity to which I have formerly alluded, but this was by no means the case. Indeed, to say the truth, that trait of mind in the philosophic Bon did begin at length to assume a character of strange intensity and mysticism, and however singular it may seem, appeared deeply tinctured with the grotesque diablerie of his favourite German studies. To enter the little café in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre was, at the period of our tale, to enter the sanctum of a man of genius. Bon was a man of genius. There was not a sous cuisinier in Rouen who could not have told you that Bon was a man of genius. His very cat knew it, and forbore to whisk her tail in the presence of the man of genius. His large water dog was acquainted with the fact, and upon the approach of his master, betrayed his sense of inferiority by a sanctity of deportment, a debasement of the ears, and a dropping of the lower jaw not altogether unworthy of a dog. It is, however, true that much of this habitual respect might have been attributed to the personal appearance of the metaphysician. A distinguished exterior will, I am constrained to say, have its weight even with a beast and I am willing to allow much in the outward man of the restaurateur, calculated to impress the imagination of the quadruped. There is a peculiar majesty about the atmosphere of the little grate, if I may be permitted so equivocal an expression, which mere physical bulk alone will be found at all times inefficient in creating. If, however, Bonbon was barely 3 feet in height, and if his head was diminutively small, still it was impossible to behold the rotundity of his stomach without a sense of magnificence nearly bordering upon the sublime. In its size, both dogs and men must have seen a type of his acquirements, in its immensity, a fitting habitation for his immortal soul. I might here, if it so pleased me, dilate upon the matter of habiliment and other mere circumstances of the external metaphysician. I might hint that the hair of our hero was worn short, combed smoothly over his forehead and surmounted by a conical-shaped white flannel cap and tassels, that his pea-green jerkin was not after the fashion of those worn by the common class of restaurateurs at that day, that the sleeves were something fuller than the reigning costume permitted, that the cuffs were turned up, not as usual in that barbarous period, with cloth of the same quality and colour as the garment, but faced in a more fanciful manner with the parti-coloured velvet of Genoa, that his slippers were of a bright purple, curiously filigreed, and might have been manufactured in Japan, but for the exquisite pointing of the toes and the brilliant tints of the binding and embroidery, that his breeches were of the yellow satin-like material called amiable, that his sky-blue cloak, resembling in a form a dressing wrapper, and richly bestudded all over with crimson devices, floated cavalierly upon his shoulders like a mist of the morning, and that his tout ensemble gave rise to the remarkable words of Benvenuta, the improvisatrice of Florence, that it was difficult to say whether Pierre Bonbon was indeed a bird of paradise, or the rather a very paradise of perfection. I have said that to enter the café in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre was to enter the sanctum of a man of genius. But then, it was only the man of genius who could duly estimate the merits of the sanctum. A sign consisting of a vast folio swung before the entrance. On one side of the volume was painted a bottle. On the reverse, a pâté. On the back were visible in large letters the words, Oeuvre de Bonbon. Thus was delicately shadowed forth the twofold occupation of the proprietor. Upon stepping over the threshold, the whole interior of the building presented itself to view. A long, low-pitched room of antique construction was indeed all the accommodation afforded by the café in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre. In a corner of the apartment stood the bed of the metaphysician. An array of curtains, together with a canopy à la grecque, gave it an air at once classic and comfortable. In the corner, diagonally opposite, appeared, in direct and friendly communion, the properties of the kitchen and the bibliothèque. A dish of polemics stood peacefully upon the dresser. Here lay an oven full of the latest ethics. There a kettle of duodecimo melange. Volumes of German morality were hand in glove with the gridiron. A toasting fork might be discovered by the side of Eusebius. Plato reclined at his ease in the frying pan, and contemporary manuscripts were filed away upon the spit. End of section 17. Section 18 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. Bonbon, Part 2. In other respects, the Café de Bonbon might be said to differ little from the cafés of the period. A gigantic fireplace yawned opposite the door. On the right of the fireplace, an open cupboard displayed a formidable array of labelled bottles. There, Mousseau, Chambertin, Saint-Georges, Richebourg, Bordeaux, Margaux, Aubryon, Leonville, Medoc, Sauterne, Barac, Prégnac, Grave, Lafitte, and Saint-Péray contended with many other names of lesser celebrity for the honour of being coiffed. From the ceiling, suspended by a chain of very long, slender links, swung a fantastic iron lamp, throwing a hazy light over the room and relieving in some measure the placidity of the scene. It was here, about 12 o'clock one night, during the severe winter of, that Pierre Bonbon, after having listened for some time to the comments of his neighbours upon his singular propensity, that Pierre Bonbon, I say, having turned them all out of his house, locked the door upon them with a sacre Dieu, and betook himself in no very pacific mood to the comforts of a leather-bottomed armchair and a fire of blazing faggots. It was one of those terrific nights which are only met with once or twice during a century. The snow drifted down bodily in enormous masses, and the Café de Bonbon tottered to its very centre, with the floods of wind that, rushing through the crannies in the wall and pouring impetuously down the chimney, shook awfully the curtains of the philosopher's bed and disorganized the economy of his pâté pans and papers. The huge folio sign that swung without, exposed to the fury of the tempest, creaked ominously and gave out a moaning sound from its stanchions of solid oak. I have said that it was in no very placid temper the metaphysician drew up his chair to its customary station by the hearth. Many circumstances of a perplexing nature had occurred during the day to disturb the serenity of his meditations. In attempting des œufs à la princesse, he had unfortunately perpetrated an omelette à la reine. The discovery of a principle in ethics had been frustrated by the overturning of a stew, and last, not least, he had been thwarted in one of those admirable bargains which he at all times took such especial delight in bringing to a successful termination. But in the chafing of his mind at these unaccountable vicissitudes, there did not fail to be mingled a degree of that nervous anxiety which the fury of a boisterous night is so well calculated to produce. Whistling to his more immediate vicinity the large black water dog we have spoken of before, and settling himself uneasily in his chair, he could not help casting a wary and unquiet eye towards those distant recesses of the apartment, whose inexorable shadows not even the red firelight itself could more than partially succeed in overcoming. Having completed a scrutiny whose exact purpose was perhaps unintelligible to himself, Bonbon drew closer to his seat, a small table covered with books and papers, and soon became absorbed in the task of retouching a voluminous manuscript intended for publication on the morrow. "I am in no hurry, Monsieur Bonbon," whispered a whining voice in the apartment. "The devil!" ejaculated our hero, starting to his feet, overturning the table at his side, and staring around him in astonishment. "Very true," calmly replied the voice. "Very true? What is very true? How came you here?" vociferated the metaphysician, as his eye fell upon something which lay stretched at full length upon the bed. "I was saying," said the intruder, without attending to Bonbon's interrogatories, "I was saying that I am not at all pushed for time, that the business upon which I took the liberty of calling is of no pressing importance. In short, that I can very well wait until you have finished your exposition." "My exposition? There now, how do you know? How came you to understand that I was writing an exposition? Good God!" "Hush!" replied the figure in a shrill undertone, and arising quickly from the bed, he made a single step towards our hero, while the iron lamp overhead swung convulsively back from his approach. The philosopher's amazement did not prevent a narrow scrutiny of the stranger's dress and appearance. The outlines of a figure, exceedingly lean but much above the common height, were rendered minutely distinct by means of a faded suit of black cloth, which fitted tight to the skin, but was otherwise cut very much in the style of a century ago. These garments had evidently been intended a priori for a much shorter person than their present owner. His ankles and wrists were left naked for several inches. In his shoes, however, a pair of very brilliant buckles gave the lie to the extreme poverty implied by the other portions of his dress. His head was bare and entirely bald, with the exception of the hinder part, from which depended a queue of considerable length. A pair of green spectacles with side glasses protected his eyes from the influence of the light, and at the same time prevented our hero from ascertaining either their colour or their conformation. About the entire person there was no evidence of a shirt, but a white cravat, of filthy appearance, was tied with extreme precision around the throat, and the ends hanging down formally side by side gave, although I dare say unintentionally, the idea of an ecclesiastic. Indeed, many other points, both in his appearance and demeanour, might have very well sustained a conception of that nature. Over his left ear he carried, after the fashion of a modern clerk, an instrument resembling the stylus of the ancients. In a breast pocket of his coat appeared conspicuously a small black volume fastened with clasps of steel. This book, whether accidentally or not, was so turned outwardly from the person as to discover the words Rituel Catholique in white letters upon the back. His entire physiognomy was interestingly saturnine, even cadaverously pale. The forehead was lofty and deeply furrowed with the ridges of contemplation. The corners of the mouth were drawn down into an expression of the most submissive humility. There was also a clasping of the hands as he stepped towards our hero, a deep sigh, and altogether a look of such utter sanctity as could not have failed to be unequivocally prepossessing. Every shadow of anger faded from the countenance of the metaphysician, as, having completed a satisfactory survey of his visitor's person, he shook him cordially by the hand and conducted him to a seat. There would, however, be a radical error in attributing this instantaneous transition of feeling in the philosopher to any one of those causes which might naturally be supposed to have had an influence. Indeed, Pierre Bonbon, from what I have been able to understand of his disposition, was of all men the least likely to be imposed upon by any speciousness of exterior deportment. It was impossible that so accurate an observer of men and things should have failed to discover, upon the moment, the real character of the personage who had thus intruded upon his hospitality. To say no more, the conformation of his visitor's feet was sufficiently remarkable. There was a tremulous swelling in the hinder part of his breeches, and the vibration of his coat tail was a palpable fact. Judge, then, with what feelings of satisfaction our hero found himself thrown thus at once into the society of a person for whom he had at all times entertained such unqualified respect. He was, however, too much of the diplomatist to let escape him any intimation of his suspicions, or rather, I should say, his certainty in regard to the true state of affairs. It was not his cue to appear at all conscious of the high honour he thus unexpectedly enjoyed, but by leading his guest into conversation to elicit some important ethical ideas which might, in obtaining a place in his contemplated publication, enlighten the human race and at the same time immortalize himself, ideas which, I should have added, his visitor's great age and well-known proficiency in the science of morals might very well have enabled him to afford. Actuated by these enlightened views, our hero bade the gentleman sit down, while he himself took occasion to throw some faggots upon the fire, and place upon the now re-established table some bottles of the powerful vin de Mousseau. Having quickly contemplated these operations, he drew his chair vis-à-vis to his companion's and waited until he should open the conversation. But plans, even the most skillfully matured, are often thwarted in the outset of their application, and the restaurateur found himself entirely nonplussed by the very first words of his visitor's speech. "I see you know me, Bonbon," said he. "Ha ha ha! He he he! Hi hi hi! Ho ho ho! Hoo hoo hoo!" And the devil, dropping at once the sanctity of his demeanour, opened to its fullest extent a mouth from ear to ear, so as to display a set of jagged and fang-like teeth, and throwing back his head, laughed long, loud, wickedly and uproariously, while the black dog, crouching down upon his haunches, joined lustily in the chorus, and the tabby cat, flying off at a tangent, stood up on end and shrieked in the farthest corner of the apartment. Not so the philosopher. He was too much of a man of the world either to laugh like the dog, or by shrieks to betray the indecorous trepidation of the cat. It must be confessed, however, that he felt a little astonishment to see the white letters which formed the words Rituel Catholique on the book in his guest's pocket, momentarily changing both their colour and their import, and in a few seconds, in place of the original title, the words Regitre de Condamne blaze forth in characters of red. This startling circumstance, when Bonbon replied to his visitor's remark, imparted to his manner an air of embarrassment which might not probably have otherwise been observable. "Why, sir," said the philosopher, "why, sir, to speak sincerely, I believe you are, upon my word, dest. That is to say, I think, I imagine, I have some very faint idea of the remarkable honour." Yes. "Very well," interrupted His Majesty. "Say no more. I see how it is." And hereupon, taking off his green spectacles, he wiped the glasses carefully with the sleeve of his coat and deposited them in his pocket. End of section 18. Section 19 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. Bonbon, Part 3. If Bonbon had been astonished at the incident of the book, his amazement was now increased to an intolerable degree by the spectacle which here presented itself to view. In raising his eyes with a strong feeling of curiosity to ascertain the colour of his guests, he found them by no means black, as he had anticipated, nor grey, as might have been imagined, nor yet hazel, nor blue, nor indeed yellow, nor red, nor purple, nor white, nor green, nor any other colour in the heavens above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth. In short, Pierre Bonbon not only saw plainly that His Majesty had no eyes whatsoever, but could discover no indications of their having existed at any previous period, for the space where eyes should naturally have been was, I am constrained to say, simply a dead level of cadaverous flesh. It was not in the nature of the metaphysician to forbear making some inquiry into the sources of so strange a phenomenon, and to his surprise, the reply of His Majesty was at once prompt, dignified, and satisfactory. "Eyes, my dear Bonbon, eyes, did you say? I perceive. The ridiculous prints, which are in circulation, have given you a false idea of my personal appearance. Eyes! True. Eyes, Pierre Bonbon, are very well in their proper place. That, you would say, is the head, right? The head of a worm. To you, likewise, these optics are indispensable. Yet I will convince you that my vision is more penetrating than your own. There is a cat I see in the corner, a pretty cat. Look at her. Observe her well. Now, Bonbon, do you behold the thoughts? The thoughts, I say, the ideas, the reflections, engendering in her pericranium? There it is now. You do not. She is thinking we admire the profundity of her mind. She has just concluded that I am the most distinguished of ecclesiastics, and that you are the most superfluous of metaphysicians. Thus you see, I am not altogether blind, but to one of my profession the eyes you speak of would be merely an encumbrance, liable at any time to be put out by a toasting iron or a pitchfork. To you, I allow, these optics are indispensable. Endeavour, Bonbon, to use them well. My vision is the soul. Hereupon the guest helped himself to the wine upon the table, and pouring out a bumper for Bonbon, requested him to drink it without scruple, and make himself perfectly at home. A clever book that of yours, Pierre, resumed His Majesty, tapping our friend knowingly upon the shoulder, as the latter set down his glass after a thorough compliance with this injunction. A clever book that of yours, upon my honour. It's a work after my own heart. Your arrangement of matter, I think, however, might be improved, and many of your notions remind me of Aristotle. That philosopher was one of my most intimate acquaintances. I liked him as much for his terrible ill temper as for his happy knack at making a blunder. There is only one solid truth in all that he has written, and for that I gave him the hint out of pure compassion for his absurdity. I suppose, Pierre Bonbon, you very well know to what divine moral truth I am alluding. Cannot say that I indeed. Why, I told Aristotle that by sneezing men expelled superfluous ideas through the proboscis. Which is undoubtedly the case, said the metaphysician, while he poured out for himself another bumper of Mousseau, and offered his snuff-box to the fingers of his visitor. There was Plato too, continued His Majesty, modestly declining the snuff-box and the compliment. There was Plato too, for whom I, at one time, felt all the affection of a friend. You knew Plato, Bonbon? Ah, no, I beg 1,000 pardons. He met me at Athens one day in the Parthenon, and told me he was distressed for an idea. I bade him write down that «O nous estin augos». He said that he would do so, and went home, while I stepped over to the pyramids. But my conscience smote me for the lie, and hastening back to Athens, I arrived behind the philosopher's chair as he was inditing the Augas. Giving the gamma a fillip with my finger, I turned it upside down. So the sentence now reads, «O nous estin aulos», and is, you perceive, the fundamental doctrine of his metaphysics. Were you ever at Rome? Asked the restaurateur as he finished his second bottle of Mousseau and drew from the closet a larger supply of vin de chambertin. But once, Monsieur Bonbon, but once. There was a time, said the devil, as if reciting some passage from a book. There was an anarchy of 5 years, during which the Republic, bereft of all its officers, had no magistracy besides the tribunes of the people, and these were not legally vested with any degree of executive power. At that time, Monsieur Bonbon, at that time only I was in Rome, and I have no earthly acquaintance, consequently, with any of its philosophy. What do you think of Epicurus? What do you think of Epicurus. What do I think of whom? What do I think of whom? Said the devil in astonishment. You cannot surely mean to find any fault with Epicurus. What do I think of Epicurus? Do you mean me, sir? I am Epicurus. I am the same philosopher who wrote each of the 300 treatises commemorated by Diogenes, Laertes. That's a lie, said the metaphysician, for the wine had gotten a little into his head. Very well, sir. Very well indeed, sir, said His Majesty. That's a lie, repeated the restaurateur dogmatically. That's a lie. Well, have it your own way, said the devil pacifically, and Bonbon, having beaten His Majesty at an argument, thought it his duty to conclude a second bottle of Chambertin. As I was saying, resumed the visitor, as I was observing a little while ago, there are some very outre notions in that book of yours, Monsieur Bonbon. What, for instance, do you mean by all that humbug about the soul? Pray, sir, what is the soul? The soul, repeated the metaphysician, referring to his MS, is undoubtedly no, sir. Indubitably, no, sir. Indisputably, no, sir. Evidently, no, sir. Incontrovertibly, no, sir. Heck, no, sir. And beyond all question, a no, sir. The soul is no such thing. Here the philosopher finished his third bottle of Chambertin. Then, pray, sir, what is it? That is neither here nor there, Monsieur Bonbon, replied His Majesty musingly. I have tasted, that is to say, I have known some very bad souls, and some too pretty good ones. Here the devil licked his lips, and having unconsciously let fall his hand upon the volume in his pocket, was seized with a violent fit of sneezing. His Majesty continued. There was the soul of Cratinus, passable. Aristophanes, racy. Plato, exquisite. Not your Plato, but Plato the comic poet. Your Plato would have turned the stomach of Cerberus. Faugh! Then let me see. There was Novius, and Andronicus, and Plautus, and Terentius. Then there were Lucilius, and Catullus, and Naso, and Quintius Flaccus. Dear Quinty, as I called him when he sung a secular for my amusement, while I toasted him in pure good humour on a fork. But they want flavour, these Romans. One fat Greek is worth a dozen of them, and besides, will keep, which cannot be said of a curate. Let us taste your sauterne. Bonbon had by this time made up his mind to the nil admirari, and endeavoured to hand down the bottles in question. He was, however, conscious of a strange sound in the room, like the wagging of a tail. Of this, although extremely indecent in His Majesty, the philosopher took no notice, simply kicking the black water dog and requesting him to be quiet. The visitor continued. I found that Horace tasted very much like Aristotle. You know I am fond of variety. Terentius I could not have told from Menander. Naso, to my astonishment, was Nicander in disguise. Virgilius had a strong twang of Theocritus. Martial put me much in mind of Archilochus, and Titus Livy was positively Polybius and none other. Hiccup! Here, replied Bonbon, and His Majesty proceeded. But if I have a penchant, Monsieur Bonbon, if I have a penchant, it is for a philosopher. Yet let me tell you, sir, it is not every gentleman who knows how to choose a philosopher. Long ones are not good, and the best, if not carefully shelled, are apt to be a little rancid on account of the gall. Shelled? I mean taken out of the carcass. What do you think of physician? Don't mention them. Ugh. Here His Majesty retched violently. I never tasted but one, that rascal Hippocrates, smelt of asafoetida. Caught a wretched cold washing him in the Styx, and after all he gave me the cholera morbus. The wretch, ejaculated Bonbon, the abortion of a pillbox, and the philosopher dropped a tear. After all, continued the visitor, after all, if a gentleman wishes to live, he must have more talents than one or two, and with us a fat face is an evidence of diplomacy. How so? Why, we are sometimes exceedingly pushed for provisions. You must know that in a climate so sultry as mine, it is frequently impossible to keep a spirit alive for more than 2 or 3 hours. And after death, unless pickled immediately, and a pickled spirit is not good, they will smell, you understand. Putrefaction is always to be apprehended when the spirits are consigned to us in the usual way. Good God, how do you manage? Here the iron lamp commenced swinging with redoubled violence, and the devil half started from his seat. However, with a slight sigh he recovered his composure, merely saying to our hero in a low tone, I tell you what, Pierre Bonbon, we must have no more swearing. Bonbon swallowed another bumper, and his visitor continued. Why, there are several ways of managing. The most of us starve, some put up with the pickle. For my part, I purchase my spirits viventi corpore, in which case I find they keep very well. But the body, vociferated the philosopher as he finished a bottle of Sauterne. The body, well, what of the body? I perceive. Why, sir, the body is not at all affected by the transaction. I have made innumerable purchases of the kind in my day, and the parties never experience any inconvenience. There was Cain, and Nimrod, and Nero, and Caligula, and Dionysus, and Pisistratus, and 1,000 others who never knew what it was to have a soul during the latter part of their lives. Yet, sir, these men adorned society. Why isn't there now, whom you know as well as I, is he not in possession of all his faculties, mental and corporeal? Who writes a keener epigram? Who reasons more wittily? Who? But stay, I have his agreement in my pocket-book. Thus saying, he produced a red leather wallet, and took from it a number of papers. Upon some of these Bonbon caught a glimpse of the letters M-A-C-H-I, M-A-Z-A, R-I-C-H, and the words Caligula and Elizabeth. His Majesty selected a narrow slip of parchment, and from it read aloud the following words. In consideration of certain mental endowments, which it is unnecessary to specify, and in farther consideration of 1,000 louis d'or, I, being aged 1 year and 1 month, do hereby make over to the bearer of this agreement all my right, title, and appurtenance in the shadow called my soul. Signed, A. Here His Majesty repeated a name which I do not feel myself justifiable in indicating more unequivocally. A clever fellow, that A, resumed he, but like you, Monsieur Bonbon, he was mistaken about the soul. The soul, a shadow, truly. No such nonsense, Monsieur Bonbon. The soul, a shadow. Ha ha ha. He he he. Hoo hoo hoo. Only think of a fricasseed shadow. Only think of a fricasseed shadow, echoed our hero, whose faculties were becoming gloriously illuminated by the profundity of His Majesty's discourse. Only think of a fricasseed shadow. Now, damn! Humph! If I would have been such a nincompoop. My soul, Mr. Humph! Your soul, Monsieur Bonbon? Yes, sir. My soul is... What, sir? No shadow, damn. Did not mean to say. Yes, sir. My soul is... Humph. Yes, sir. Did not intend to assert. My soul is... peculiarly qualified for... a... What, sir? Stew. Ha! Soufflé. Eh? Fricassee? Indeed. Ragout or fricando, and I'll let you have it. A bargain. Couldn't think of such a thing, said His Majesty calmly, at the same time arising from his seat. The metaphysician stared. Am supplied at present, said His Majesty. Eh? Said the philosopher. Have no funds on hand. What? Besides, very ungentlemanly in me, sir, to take advantage of your present situation. Here His Majesty bowed and withdrew, in what manner the philosopher could not precisely ascertain, but in a well-concerted effort to discharge a bottle at the villain, the slender chain was severed that depended from the ceiling, and the metaphysician prostrated by the downfall of the lamp. End of section 19.